Hello, everyone. I'm Keith Mathis with the Mathis Group. We're a premier ATP with the Project Management Institute. Welcome to 7 Minutes to PMP Mastery. Today's video for the PMP exam is going to focus on when organizational change disrupts your project. One of the big shifts that has happened on the PMP test is that PMI is looking at projects as creating not just change, obviously, in a small area, but for the entire organization. And projects are being used to drive that. So that's a bigger emphasis now on our PMP test. So supporting organizational change means that the project manager does more than just deliver a scope. The project manager must understand how the organization's culture, structure, readiness, resistance, governance, leadership support, and stakeholder expectations affect project success. For the PMP exam, this topic usually appears in scenarios where a project introduces a new process, a new system, a new product, or a new operating model. Stakeholders then typically will resist the change because it's going to impact the organization as a whole. And then organizational cultures will conflict with the project approach. And so you find some questions like that. Business transformation affects project priorities, funding, scope, resources, all of those things, or the project itself just creates disruption for operations or the users. So you're noticing here that this is a bigger change than just a central project. We're talking about the macro view of that change on the organization. So why is this on the PMP exam? Well, PMI is testing this topic because modern project managers operate in that rapidly changing environment. The ECO, the exam content outline, states that the PMP questions are scenario-based and require candidates to apply project management judgment rather than simply memorizing a process. So this topic connects to the PMI-aligned exam in several different ways. First off, business environment, understanding how organizational factors affect the project success. Also, stakeholder engagement, identifying resistance and aligning expectations because we're all having to deal with this, as well as value delivery, ensuring the project produces usable business outcomes that's bringing value to the customer. And then governance and escalation, use the right decision paths when organizational change affects the scope, the funding, the priorities, or even risk itself. On this test, though, they will come at this organizational change from a predictive, an agile, and a hybrid way of thinking. And PMI expects the candidates to adapt the response to the delivery environment. So they're going to talk about it, but they're expecting you to adjust your response to that style of project for a predictive, agile, and hybrid, as well as what's happening in the organization. Organizational culture includes shared values, norms, behaviors, decision-making styles, communication patterns, risk tolerance, leadership expectations, and openness to change. For the exam, assessing the culture by asking a series of questions, such as, is the organizational hierarchy or collaborative? Are decisions centralized or distributed? Is the organizational risk adverse or innovation-oriented? Are stakeholders accustomed to agile, predictive, or hybrid delivery? Is there trust between the leaders, the teams, and the users? Are end users prepared to adopt to the change? So the impact of organizational change can be pretty significant. It may affect the project through change priorities, revised funding, new stakeholders, resource constraints, governance changes, compliance changes, resistance from users or departments, changes to the scope, the backlog, the schedule, the benefits, the risk. The ECO specifically identifies evaluating the impact of organizational change on the project and determining the required actions as part of this task. What about the impact? So the project may also impact the organization by changing the workflows, requiring training, affecting roles, responsibilities, disrupting the operations, creating new compliance responsibilities, changing customer or employee experience, requiring transition planning and benefits realization. A common PMP trap is focusing only on the project plan while ignoring the adoption, the readiness, or the operational impact. So you've got to look at it a little bit broader. Required actions. When organizational change affects the project manager should usually begin with assessing the situation, identify stakeholders, the impact, review project objectives, the business case, the benefits, the assumptions, the risks, the constraints, engage the sponsor, the product owner, the change authority, or the governance body as appropriate, and then update the relevant plans, the backlog, the risk register, the stakeholder engagement plan, communication plan, or change management approach. Communicate transparently, and then support adoption through training, engagement, feedback, and transition and readiness. So organizational change in a predictive environment. So in a predictive project, organizational change usually requires formal analysis and may trigger integrated change control. The project manager should assess impact on the scope, schedule, cost, quality, risk, resources, benefits, and stakeholder engagement before recommending any action. And the likely exam response is going to be review the change management plan, perform impact analysis, submit or process a formal change request if baselines are affected, update the plan after approval, and then communicate through the approved channels. So the predictive is going to be your traditional project. So most of us know this particular one. Organizational change in an agile environment. So in agile, organizational change is often handled through backlog refinement, stakeholder collaboration, product owner prioritization, and adaptive planning. You don't have a formal change control in agile and for the purpose of your test. So the exam response will typically be collaborate with the product owner, the stakeholders, reassess the product goal, the backlog priority and value, facilitate discussion with the team, use feedback loops, reviews, retrospectives, and incremental delivery, and support user adoption continuously. What about the hybrid environment? In hybrid, the exam will often test your ability to know which parts need to have formal control, which parts can you adapt. Usually the exam will have several components to this, such as use formal change control for baseline predictive components, use backlog reprioritization for agile components, coordinate governance, sponsor decisions, and team level adaptation, maintain alignment between business objectives and delivery work. So here's some common exam traps to watch out for. Let me give you 6 of these. Number 1, just follow the original plan. That's not true unless it's a predictive environment and it's very clear that you're jumping through the plan and the change control board. Trap number 2, escalate immediately to a sponsor. On your test, you don't typically escalate very much. And so I would lean away from this unless it's really something that's going to impact the overall arching organization and you've already done several other things before you ever escalate. Third, tell stakeholders the change is mandatory. That's not typically what happens on the test, and so that's not one of the ones that I would take initially. Ignore culture because it's outside of the project. Culture always has an influence someplace on the project or on the project once we hand it off to the customer. So we have to take that into account. Treat all change as scope change. All change is not scope change. So you want to look and see what is that change that's going to take place. And then last, assume agile means no change control. Remember in agile, in the iterations, we don't have we don't have changes once a iteration or a sprint begins. And so there are no change orders. So that's a trick question as well. So let's give you an example question. So a project manager is leading a hybrid project to implement a new customer service platform. The software configuration work is being managed using agile iterations, while data mitigation, migration, and compliance validation are managed predictively. Midway through the project, the organization announces a restructuring that merges 2 customer service departments. Several managers now disagree about the future workflow, and frontline employees are concerned that the new platform will eliminate familiar processes. The product owner wants the team to continue delivering the current backlog because sprint velocity is strong. The compliance lead warns that the restructuring may affect approval requirements for customer data handling. What should the project manager do first? So they're not asking you what you would do first. They're asking you what the process is, what should dictate this. So A, continue the current sprint work because agile delivery allows the backlog to be adjusted after the next sprint review. B, submit a formal change request immediately to revise the scope, schedule, and compliance plan. C, assess the impact of the organizational restructuring on stakeholders, workflows, compliance, backlog priorities, and project objectives before determining the required action. And D, escalate the disagreement to the sponsor and ask the sponsor to decide which department's workflows should be used. So as you look at these, you want to try to throw something away. And so D would be one of those that I'd have a tendency to want to throw away because it instantly tells you to escalate something. So that's typically not what PMP tests will do. So what is the answer? All right, let's look at it. So the correct answer, or the best answer, is C. There might be other correct answers that you see, but C is your best answer. You assess the impact of the organizational restructuring on stakeholders, workflows, compliance, backlog priorities, and project objectives before determining the required actions. This is the best answer because the project manager must first understand how the organizational change affects the project and how the project will affect the newly merged organization. So the scenario includes the culture, the stakeholder resistance, and so forth. Now let's look at those that you threw that you maybe made the mistake and thought it was. Let's look at the wrong ones. So why are the other answers wrong? Well, A continues the current sprint work because agile delivery allows the backlog to be adjusted after the next sprint review. This is tempting because the project has agile components. However, it ignores the immediate organizational and compliance impact. Agile does not mean that the team should continue delivering work that may no longer align with business needs, work flows, or compliance requirements. What about B? Submitting a formal change request immediately to revise the scope, schedule, and compliance plan. This may eventually be necessary, especially for a predictive component. However, it is premature. The project manager has not yet assessed the impact. PMI generally expects analysis before submitting or approving changes. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. What about D? Escalate the disagreement to the sponsor. Ask the sponsor to decide which department's workflow should be used. Escalation may be appropriate if the issue cannot be resolved at the project level. However, escalating first avoids the project manager's responsibility to assess, facilitate, engage stakeholders, and determine the impact. PMI usually expects the project manager to work the problem before you ever escalate it. And that's a good pattern to get into. All right, so as we come to the close of this, I know this is a little bit longer than the 7 minutes because I wanted to make sure we got this component into you thoroughly and give you a sample of a PMP question. So we do virtual PMP boot camps every other month. If you'll go to our website, you can sign up for something like this. This allows people to be able to tap in from anywhere in the world. I'd love to have you in a boot camp, and I hope this has been enjoyable for you and also educational for you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Have a great week now. Bye, everyone.